Welcome to BBC News, broadcasting to viewers in North America and around the globe. I'm Duncan Golostani. Our top stories. Saudi-led forces attack the main rebel-held port in Yemen, threatening vital aid supplies for millions. The American Secretary of State is in Seoul, saying there's a lot of work left to do on the deal with North Korea. Pledges to rival camps and a walkout by Scottish nationalist MPs. Theresa May has another tough Brexit day.
Welcome to Russia.
And President Putin welcomes the footballing world to Russia just hours before the first match kicks off in the World Cup. Hello and welcome to the programme. Attempts are being made to secure aid supplies for millions of people in Yemen after pro-government forces backed by Saudi Arabia launched an attack on a key port held by rebel fighters. The coastal city of Hodeidah has been held by Houthis backed by Iran for more than 3 years. The United Nations says 8.4 million Yemenis are on the verge of famine, and for most, the port is the only route for food supplies. Around 10,000 people have been killed since the start of the war 4 years ago. The British government has called on all sides to exercise restraint, and it's requested an urgent meeting of the UN Security Council to discuss the situation. Our security correspondent Frank Gardner reports now from Yemen.
Trained and equipped by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Yemeni government forces have been advancing on the Red Sea port of Hodeidah. Facing them are Yemen's Houthi rebels, who've reportedly fanned out across the city of 500,000. Diplomats have been scrambling to prevent a bloodbath. But the UAE, which is leading much of the ground force, says its patience with diplomacy has run out.
We have waited for over a year in order to secure Hodeidah out of the Houthi hands into a third-party hand. There's been a lot of diplomatic work based on that. And it has come really to nothing because the Houthis have not been very clear, not been very honest in all these efforts.
The Houthis, who control the port of Hodeidah, say the coalition are invaders and that the UN is biased against them. They accuse the Saudis of bombing the port's cranes, making it harder to offload vital supplies.
The battle in Hodeidah will lead to a humanitarian disaster in terms of food supplies.
Hodeidah is a city full of civilians, and it holds the main artery for all Yemenis in the north and south. 70% of all humanitarian aid comes through the port. Therefore, this aid will stop.
Aid agencies fear up to 250,000 people's lives could be at risk in the fighting.
Yemen is the country with the worst food insecurity in the world. More than 17 million people here have no idea when their next meal is coming from. Many of those people live in Hodeidah. They only have one meal a day. And with this conflict, with this escalation of the conflict and the level of violence that's happening right now in Hodeidah, it means that many of those people will lose that one meal.
Yemenis have already suffered over 3 years of disease, food shortages, coalition airstrikes and shelling by Houthis. What happens now in Hodeidah will decide the course of this war. Yemen has reached a turning point in the 3-year war that has ravaged this mountainous, isolated country. The UN-backed government and its coalition partners say they had no choice but to drive the Houthi rebels out of the port of Hodeidah so as not to prolong the war. But international aid agencies say this assault risks a humanitarian catastrophe. Frank Gardner, BBC News in Yemen.
President Trump has declared there is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea. He's arrived back in the United States from the summit in Singapore and said his meeting with Kim Jong-un was a truly historic event. His Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, is in South Korea to begin talks about the details of the process of denuclearization. This report from John Sudworth contains some flash photography.
In North Korea, most of the information-starved masses had heard nothing about the summit until today. It is, of course, being sold to them as a great victory. Donald Trump is halting the US-South Korean joint military exercises, the newsreader says. The suspension of the drills, for so long such a key feature of America's alliance with South Korea, appears to have taken many in the region by surprise, not least South Korea itself. The Japanese defense minister made his concern clear today.
The drills and the US military stationed in South Korea play a vital role in East Asia's security.
But back on the ground after his flight home from the Singapore summit, Donald Trump was on Twitter again. There is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea, he said. And yet, having criticised his predecessors for being outplayed, the deal Mr. Trump has signed is just as vague as any that have gone before, and he appears to have given up so much more. Across Asia and beyond, there's a sense of people wondering what on earth just happened. Rather than concern, though, here in Beijing, the surprise is one of delight. China has long argued for a suspension of those military exercises, although you have to wonder whether it ever thought it would get it. At a stroke, the old geopolitical certainties have been turned upside down. In the South Korean capital, there are those who back Donald Trump's faith in Kim Jong-un. We need to show trust and believe in him, this woman says. The US Secretary of State has now arrived in South Korea before heading to China. Some in this region will want a lot more detail before they're convinced this really is a formula for peace. John Sudworth, BBC News, Beijing.
OK, let's return now to our top story. Saudi-led forces have attacked the main rebel-held port in Yemen, threatening vital aid supplies for millions. Well, joining me live now from Washington is a former US ambassador, James Jeffrey, now with the Washington Institute. Ambassador Jeffrey served in Ankara and Baghdad and has focused on relations with Iran. It's great to have you here on BBC World News. First of all, can I just check, do you agree that this offensive in the port of Hodeidah risks a humanitarian catastrophe, as many aid agencies are now saying?
I'm not so sure about a catastrophe. I just checked 20 minutes ago with the UN report on how many civilians have been killed in the last 3.5 years of this war. It's about 6,000. Every death is a tragedy, but compared to about 10 conflicts that I've experienced in the Middle East, that is not a large number. We have a catastrophe potentially because Yemen is a failed state. I've been there, and at any given time, there's a danger of starvation, there's a danger of cholera, and this port is the major artery for relief supplies into the country. So relief agencies are right to be concerned. The other problem is, though, that this port is also the main supply route for Iranian weapons to the Houthi rebels who are fighting both the government of Yemen and the Saudi and Emirate forces, and those forces are trying to block this supply route.
Do you think the United States has a role to play here? Should it be standing aside and allowing this offensive at the port if it is going to make the humanitarian situation that much worse?
Having lived through, including on the ground as his ambassador in Iraq, the Obama years, I'm convinced that we have to look at the region as a whole, as a campaign to stop Iranian expansion. That has a slice in Iraq, a very big slice with over 400,000 killed in Syria, a slice in Lebanon, also a slice in Yemen. And that's the bigger picture. The United States is trying to do two things: preserve the flow of humanitarian goods to the people who need it, and that's much of the population, but also to support the offensive against the Houthi rebels. The Houthi rebels have been offered the chance to evacuate the port. So far, they have not seized that opportunity, and the danger is, of course, that they'll fight on every block.
But are you saying you're willing to see the humanitarian situation get worse in order for it to get better in the long term? That seems to be what you're saying.
We'd have to debate about what get worse is. In Yemen, every day,
getting worse is blocking off the main supply route into the country, the main supply route for medical supplies in a country that barely has a healthcare system now.
That country didn't have a healthcare system a dozen years ago when I was there. Get worse is something that the U.S. is watching closely. The U.S. in the UN through Martin Griffiths, the UN coordinator, are trying to broker a ceasefire and to get the two sides to separate so that the city can be declared an open city. The UN can administer it. There are various ways to do this. But this requires the Houthis, who are under the thumb of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, to agree, and they haven't agreed so far.
Briefly, Mr. Ambassador, if you would, with your extensive diplomatic experience, do you hold out any hope for a closed-door UN meeting happening Thursday?
First of all, the UN meeting will happen. I'm actually pretty optimistic. I think that the Emirati forces and the Saudi forces have been warned by Washington that the support that Washington's giving them is contingent upon no massive new deaths or humanitarian catastrophe. So I think they're going to be careful. And I think that the Houthis are under pressure too. So I wouldn't give up hope yet that there can't be a peaceful solution to this thing that gets the evacuation of the Houthis and gets the city back doing its job of providing assistance to the people of Yemen.
Okay, former US Ambassador James Jeffrey, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's take a look at some more stories making the news now. And the French National Assembly has overwhelmingly backed a landmark bill to overhaul the country's heavily indebted state-run railway, SNCF. The vote is seen as a victory for President Macron and a blow to rail unions who staged rolling strikes over the bill. Pro- and anti-abortion demonstrators have been gathering outside Argentina's Congress as lawmakers are due to vote on a bill that would allow women to have abortions in the first 14 weeks of pregnancy. Abortion is currently illegal, except in extreme cases such as rape, or if the woman's life is at risk. Comcast, the giant US cable television provider, has opened a bidding war for the media assets of 21st Century Fox. It's offered $65 billion, 19% more than a rival bid by the Walt Disney Corporation. Comcast says its cash deal is superior to Disney's all-stock offer. The British Prime Minister is under increasing pressure over the government's approach to Brexit. Some Conservative members of Parliament who want to retain closer ties with the European Union said they fear Theresa May could fail to deliver on promises they were given. During Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, Scottish Nationalist Party MPs staged a mass walkout, claiming Scotland's voice was being ignored in the Brexit debate. Our political editor Laura Koonsberg has the latest.
Don't walk into the pillar.
Farce?
What promises have you made to the Tory rebels?
A bit of pantomime?
It's a beautiful... I wanted a quiet walk to work, that's what I wanted. No,
You might not be blamed for wondering if it looks a bit like that. But it's the woman who lives in Downing Street who's the one trying to keep it all together.
Can you really please both sides, Prime Minister?
She's the one trying to stick to promises that perhaps can't all be kept. But for Theresa May, it's certainly not a laughing matter.
There may now be a meltdown. They're not actually my words, but those of the Foreign Secretary, even as his fellow cabinet ministers are preparing people for the government's negotiations.
Joking apart, listen carefully. This is Theresa May committing to think again, giving Parliament more power if they vote down the eventual deal with the European Union.
I have agreed this morning with the Brexit Secretary that we will bring forward an amendment in the Lords. But there are a number of issues, a number of things that will guide our approach in doing so.
The Prime Minister made it to this morning, avoiding defeat last night, because some of the wannabe rebels believe she made them a promise behind closed doors, that she'd change her plans for what happens if the final Brexit deal explodes.
I trust the Prime Minister, and I know she will be true to her word. It would be a terrible betrayal if she weren't, and she is a woman of her word, and she's just given an absolute undertaking at the dispatch box. Job done.
But in what feels like a game of she said, he said, not everyone's version of exactly what was promised is precisely the same.
It will in the end be determined by what actually is conceded, and it's too soon to tell. My fear, however, is that the damage, frankly, has already been done.
The Tories are hardly talking each other's language, let alone the rest of ours. But what's happening is that the Prime Minister is trying to please a faction of her party who want Parliament to have more control if the final Brexit deal goes sour. But she also has to keep on board dozens of others who think if that happened, the best thing might be simply to walk away. But you can hardly please all of the people all of the time, even on your own side. The leader of the SNP in Westminster was cross too.
Give him the disrespect it's shown.
That last night there were only minutes of debate about how Brexit affects Scotland, so used dusty rules of the Commons to provoke a row.
I order the right honourable gentleman to withdraw immediately from the House.
Predictably thrown out by the Speaker.
Very well.
Applauded adoringly by his own side.
We have had changes to the devolution settlement that were pushed through last night without Scottish MPs' voices being heard. That's a democratic outrage.
But Labour had its own drama tonight. 90 MPs went against Jeremy Corbyn's orders on yet another vote about keeping close ties to the EU. 5 of his front bench, including some of his shiny new MPs, quit their roles to do so. Brexit is complicated for all the parties, and that gives the government's foes many reasons to attack. The Prime Minister is not the only one struggling to contain every peck. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Stay with us here on BBC News, still to come. All footballing eyes turn to Russia with final preparations underway before the World Cup kicks off on Thursday. Welcome back. You're watching BBC News. These are the latest headlines. The Saudi-led coalition in Yemen has launched a major offensive on the rebel-held port of Hodeidah, through which almost all aid supplies enter the country, where millions face malnutrition. And the American Secretary of State on a visit to Seoul has said he hopes there will be a major disarmament of North Korea within 2.5 years. And we're going to stay with that story because the man you just saw there, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, is due to speak any moment in Seoul at a press conference with his South Korean and Japanese counterparts. You can see there the lectern set up and the flags out for that press conference. And I think that's going to be quite an interesting press conference, actually, because, of course, while that summit in Singapore was unprecedented, that meeting between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, of course, the detail was a little thin on the ground. So maybe from this press conference we might start to see some sort of plan being fleshed out. And of course this is two countries with incredibly vested interests in any deal with North Korea, given the security arrangements between the United States and South Korea and Japan. South Korea, we believe, taken by surprise by Donald Trump's promise to end military exercise is with that country. And of course, Japan, very mindful of its security umbrella from the United States. So it'll be very interesting to see the three countries up there speaking. That's a live event that we are hoping to bring you in the coming hour. But now, the United Nations has passed a resolution calling for international protection for civilians living in the occupied Palestinian territory. 120 members voted in favour, with 8 against and 45 abstaining. The ambassador to the UN for the Palestinian Authority, Riyad Mansour, said he didn't understand why some countries opposed the resolution.
To condemn, to regret, to express concern is not sufficient. We need action, we need protection of our civilian population. And why should that be offending anyone? We're just asking for a simple thing. We want our civilian population to be protected. Is that a crime to ask for?
The resolution, which condemned Israel for excessive use of force, was criticised by the United States, who had lobbied for Palestinian militant group Hamas be included in the text.
What makes Gaza different for some is that attacking Israel is their favorite political sport. That's why we're here today. The nature of this resolution clearly demonstrates that politics is driving the day. It is totally one-sided. It makes not one mention of Hamas, who routinely initiates violence in Gaza. Such one-sided resolutions at the UN do nothing to advance peace between Israel and the Palestinians.
Nikki Haley speaking there. Now, Russia takes on Saudi Arabia in Moscow on Thursday as the 2018 World Cup kicks off. 32 teams will compete for the trophy, with the matches being played in 11 different cities. Away from the games, there's been some focus on security concerns and political tensions. Here's our sports editor, Dan Rowan.
Whether you like it or not, Russia is about to play host to football's greatest showpiece. And wherever it's staged, there's still nothing quite like it in sport. Fans from around the world already enjoying the build-up here in Moscow. Politics is never far away from such occasions, and today President Putin himself made a surprise appearance at a FIFA meeting. Our country is ready to host the World Cup, he said, to provide all those who come to Russia the best time and the most positive experience.
Welcome to Russia.
Putin's ordered a crackdown on the kind of Russian hooliganism that marred Euro 2016. Sergei was one of those convicted after the violence and served 7 months in a French prison, but told me there'll be no repeat.
A lot of work was made by police with supporters, fans, hooligans to protect this World Championship. I suppose no. I suppose this will be a holiday of football.
Racism continues to mar the game here. Russian football authorities fined after France players suffered racial abuse during a friendly in March.
For Russia, this is a very big moment because relations with the West have soured immeasurably since they were awarded this tournament. They are now trying to carve out a niche for themselves on the world stage, and to have, basic levels of racism taking place will mean that their big moment is being tarnished.
Amid geopolitical and diplomatic tensions, many in the West see this as a vanity project for President Putin, and he's sure to play a prominent role here at the Luzhniki Stadium tomorrow when the tournament kicks off. But despite the fact that sport and politics have never felt quite so closely linked, on the pitch, Russia 2018 has the potential to be a footballing spectacle.
The drama's already begun. One of the favourites, Spain, remarkably sacking their coach today over his decision to join Real Madrid. And when the action does start, the first use at a World Cup of VAR, the video assistant referee, is sure to spark debate.
Hopefully the system they're using here can be really smooth and everything can go well, and obviously it's good for the game if we get the right decisions, because there's so much riding on the decisions.
And spare a thought for this man, the coach of Russia, managing a warm welcome despite his team being the worst ranked in the tournament.
Home team must be good because the people have interest in only for our team.
Lots of pressure on you?
Yes, not pressure.
No?
It's not that normal job.
The world's best players will now compete for the sport's greatest prize. The countdown almost complete to a World Cup that could be as compelling as it is controversial. Dan Rowan, BBC News, Moscow.
That is just the way it's looking this hour. But let's go back to Seoul now, where we're waiting for that press conference between US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and his counterparts from South Korea and Japan, Taro Kono and Gan Kyung-hwa. We're expecting to hear them giving reaction to that unprecedented meeting between Donald Trump and the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and hopefully getting more details about what was in that agreement and exactly what was agreed to. From South Korea's perspective, what will happen to the military exercises that it carries out with the United States and the troops stationed in South Korea. And from Japan's point of view, it will have security concerns. We're going to stay with these pictures, but you're watching BBC World News. I'm Duncan Golostani.